Hey guys, Mick Murray here. I'm the Director of Equipping at Antioch in Waco, and I'm excited to break down a little bit of God's heart for work with you today. The reality is, for the majority of us who work from 18 to about 67 years old, and I'm including school in that, that occupies about 100,000 hours of our life. And these are key hours, the center of the day, the middle of our lives where we have the most energy. And what's sad is that a lot of people, a lot of Christians, they don't have vision for their work. They don't know how it connects with the purpose of God. So a lot of us live very compartmentalized lives where we have kind of the spiritual components of our lives over here, and then our work is over here, and it's disconnected. And it's so sad because that's a huge part of our life, a huge chunk of the primary hours of our life. And not just that practically, but work is central to the heart of God. It's central to who He is. A little bit of background on myself. I did not grow up a believer. My dad was a workaholic, and I'm so grateful for him. He provided for us. But it wasn't until later in high school and then in college that I had a series of just kind of divine encounters and came to Christ, came to Waco to run track at Baylor, got connected to Antioch, and really the rest is history, jumping into the college ministry, being discipled, meeting the Holy Spirit. And so it's been quite a journey for me. I've had a little bit of work ADD. Ministry has been the most consistent part of my life, working with the church for the past 16 years, but I've also worked in sales, worked in finance. My wife and I have started a couple of small businesses, and most recently I've worked doing a little bit of management consulting. So I've straddled both worlds to some extent, and work is just a central part of how God has revealed Himself to me throughout the years. So why? What's God's purpose for work? Why is there such a breakdown in people's minds between, again, the more overtly spiritual components of their lives and then the work component of our lives? I want to go way back to the beginning where Antioch, we often start in Genesis 1 and 2. And you see in Genesis 1 and 2 that God establishes three relationships for mankind. You see this throughout those first two chapters, but acutely in chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, where God makes man in His own image. In the image of God, He creates them. Male and female, He creates them. And right off the bat, we see that God established mankind for relationship with Himself. We were made in the image of God to emote, to think rationally, to be able to connect through communication. And this is a primary call for being human, is to relate with God in fellowship. The second relationship that He creates man for is one another. He creates Adam. He creates Eve out of Adam. He puts them in the first marriage. And so we see that not just the God-man relationship, but the man-man relationship that mankind was created for. But the third relationship, and this often gets overlooked, at least in our kind of church expressions and tradition, is the man-world relationship, or the man-creation relationship. So you have the God-man relationship, the man-man relationship, but then God places mankind in the physical earth and gives Adam and Eve stewardship over the garden to tend it and to take care of it. And this is a central part of both the mission of God and the heart of God for mankind. Now, you know the story, many of you, that Adam and Eve rejected God's authority. It's known as the fall. The curse follows. And all three of those relationships, which had existed in perfect harmony, what the Hebrews called shalom, it was whole, it was united, it was purposeful, and it was at peace. The God-man relationship, the man-man relationship, and the man-creation relationship, that was shattered. It was fractured. It was fragmented. And so Adam and Eve are immediately hiding themselves from God. They're blaming one another. And then part of the curse is that God says, now out of the ground, you will produce the fruit of the ground through toil. There'll be blood, sweat, and tears, thorns and thistles. And there's this fragmentation that's introduced to these three relationships. And that begins then the story of redemption history from Genesis 3 all the way to Revelation chapter 20, where God is reconciling all of these fragments, all these broken pieces back to Himself in the person of Jesus. Ephesians 1 and Colossians 1 talk about the reconciliation of all things in the person of Jesus. Now, in our church background, a lot of times we think of redemption as part of that between God and man, and that's primary. That's the lead piece. We have to be reconciled to God first and foremost to be reconnected to the life of God. But it doesn't end there. it also includes reconciliation among mankind, human relationships, being reconciled to our brothers and sisters in Christ, and being reconcilers to those who are outside of the family of God. But it also extends to our stewardship of the earth, to creation itself. What does it mean to be those who are reconciling the created order to God? And a lot of times that's where that breaks down, and we don't know how our physical work on earth connects to the mission of God. So I want to take the rest of the time here and break that down briefly, because I see 5 values of work in the mission of God. 2 of them are intrinsic values, meaning they pre-existed before the fall. And 3 are instrumental values that are active within the context of redemption history after the fall and before the return of Jesus. And let me just say this as an aside. For the Hebrew, for the Jew who spoke Hebrew, they had one word that was most often translated in English into the word work, but they had one word, abad, in the Old Testament that meant meant work, service, and worship all in one. So they had this integrated understanding of what it meant to work, that it was worship to God, that it was service to people. And it's only in, again, kind of our experience where we fragment that out and we compartmentalize it and we don't see those as all fitting together. But when we talk about the intrinsic values of work, there are 2 that I see right there in the beginning in Genesis 1 and 2. And that is, first and foremost, fellowship with God. God himself is a worker. Jesus would say in John 5:17, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." We are made in his image. So in the context of work is where we find fellowship with God. Years ago, my oldest son now is 12, but when he was 18 months old, we were out in front of our house here in Waco, and I was watering the flowers. It was an extremely hot summer that summer. And I felt a little tug on the hose behind me, and I turned around, and my little chubby, pasty, white, pale-skinned toddler is just in his diaper, little Michelin rolls, and his bright blue eyes. He's standing there holding the hose, and he's grinning ear to ear. And he couldn't speak much at 18 months old, but I could tell he just wanted to do what I was doing. And so, I delighted in my heart, a relatively new father, and so we kind of went around the yard and watered the flowers, and the task took 3 times longer than it would have without his help, without his participation in my work. But the whole point of my involving him in my work wasn't efficiency, it was fellowship. The reason that I allowed him to participate with me was to build a memory, was to have relationship with my son. And I was reflecting on that sometime later, and I realized, God, that's a lot like you and us, isn't it? And I felt like he spoke to my heart. I felt like he said with a chuckle, "Mick, on your best day, you are massively slowing me down. You are inhibiting my work in the earth." But God exchanges efficiency for fellowship over and over and over again. Because he's a worker, he invites us into his work so that we can get to know his heart. It's where we find fellowship with him. And I would encourage you, challenge you, do you find fellowship with God in your work? He is a creative, innovative God. And in our work is the place where we find intimacy and fellowship with him, not just an hour in the morning, not just in our corporate worship times. Second, intrinsic value is the glory of God, that we have fellowship with God for the glory of God. Habakkuk 2:14 says, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God, of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea." And this goes back to the passage in Genesis 1:26 through 28, where God says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, over all the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. He blessed them. He said, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over it." Now, that language trips us up sometimes. We think of dominion and we think of like 20th century, Hitler, Stalin, people who subjugated other peoples, had dominion over them. But the dominion that God is talking about here is a dominion that's more like a caretaker. Like a gardener has dominion over a garden. And we see that right there in Genesis 2, when God gives Adam and Eve care of the garden that he placed them in, the Garden of Eden. And this is the type of dominion or subduing that God is talking about here. And so you think of, what is a gardener's goal? The gardener's goal is to tend carefully the plot of land to bring about maximum beauty, maximum fruitfulness. And this is the kind of commission that he's given us through our work. So our job within the context of our vocation is to bring about maximum beauty, maximum fruitfulness, to be a gardener, a caretaker. And what's seen through that is God's nature, that God, he is advocating for a flourishing human society. He's advocating for beauty. He's advocating for excellence. We see that in his nature, in his own creative powers. We see God worshiped throughout the scriptures for his creative, innovative powers. In the book of Revelation, one of the most common refrains as the throne room worship is going up is praising God for his creativity, for he created all things and sustains all things. And we reflect that in the way that we work. The glory of God is seen in the earth. Remember, I was walking with a gentleman who was a computer programmer, and he was frustrated because he wasn't the most kind of outgoing, evangelistic type of person. And he was asking, should I be in a different line of work? I'm sitting behind a computer for 9 hours a day and writing code. And early on, I didn't have a great answer for him. But later on, I said, absolutely, you're in the right line of work. God was the original programmer. He programmed our DNA. And by you writing excellent code, and the code at the time was for systems of stoplights and traffic patterns, and I was like, you're eliminating accidents. You're minimizing the amount of time people sit at red lights. You're contributing to a flourishing human society. That's the glory of God. And it's intrinsic. It's built into how he's wired this particular gentleman to be a computer programmer. It's reflecting the nature of God in how he does his work. So those are the intrinsic values of work that transcend the fall, that preceded the curse, and that are deeply embedded in each of us. And then briefly, we also have the instrumental values of work. And this is what probably most of our minds go to when we think of the purpose of work. But I want to highlight that these are built on the foundation of the intrinsic values of work. But the instrumental values of work, first is provision. And this won't be the case, I believe, in the new heavens and the new earth, where we're having to toil for our provision. God said you could eat freely from any tree of the garden, just not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But now we have to work in order to provide. 2 Thessalonians 3:10-12. Paul admonishes the church. He said, when we were with you, we'd give this command: if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. This is part of God's common grace, and how he provides for mankind is through our work. It's also his provision for the poor. Some beautiful patterns laid down in the Old Testament where the Jews were commanded not to glean all the way to the corners of their field or their vineyards, but to leave some for the poor. This is God's heart and how he provides for us. The second instrumental value is discipleship. Jesus said that we are the salt of the earth. We're a city on a hill, a light that is to be on a stand that gives light to all mankind. And this is, our workplaces are where people are. They're where the lost are. And it's where we build relationships. It's where we demonstrate the grace and the glory of God. It's where we lead people to Christ, and we're sharing and praying for our coworkers and then helping them grow in their own relationship with the Lord. I heard Bill Johnson one time, he said, we don't take salt and unscrew the cap and pour a big pile on the side of our plate. We sprinkle it over the entire plate. He said a lot of times the body of Christ is kind of piled into one corner, but God's intent is that we would be sprinkled into every domain of society, every workplace, every neighborhood for the glory of God. And I would challenge you to think of yourself as the senior pastor of your workplace, of your apartment complex, of the gym that you attend. How would you think, if you were the senior pastor of your church, how would you think about caring for your people, training and equipping them? I want you to think that way about your workplace. You've just been anointed the senior pastor of wherever you happen to work. I want to challenge you to think about making disciples in that context. And then the last instrumental value is transformation. The value of work, part of it is to see the discipleship of the whole system. Jesus said that we are to disciple nations. That's not just the souls, but the actual systems. integrating the ways of Jesus into the very fabric of the different domains within which that we work. I was thinking of a gentleman who has a consulting firm. He used to be a lawmaker, and now he helps big corporations comply with the legislation that he helped draft. But he's a spirit-filled believer. And so he meets with the executives of, let's say, Xerox, and he sits down with them, and he's actually taken parables directly from the scriptures, put them into these very complicated manuals, and he'll have these executives sit down and reflect on these ancient wisdom teachings and how they are impacting the integration and the compliance of these various kind of ethics laws and legislation. And he's discipling the whole system in terms of integrity and transparency and truthfulness. And he's discipling the whole system and how he's integrating the ways of Jesus through his own technical knowledge and savvy into the workplace in his context. So to recap, why does work matter to God? God is a worker. We are made in his image. Part of how we find fellowship with God is through our work. It's not to be compartmentalized to where we just meet with God in the morning and maybe again at the end of the night, and then we have this massive chunk of our day where we just totally disconnect from walking with the Spirit. And we were designed to fellowship with God through our work. We glorify God through our work as we have dominion over the earth, as we are caretakers like gardeners, bringing about maximum beauty and fruitfulness, displaying the glory and the nature of God through how we conduct our work. And then instrumentally, work is for provision. It's how God provides for us. Work is the place where people are. It's where we make disciples. It's where we actually disciple the entire systems. We are bringing about societal transformation through our integration into the various spheres of society. So may you work with purpose and conviction. May we not be compartmentalized people, but wholly integrated, integrating the life and the ways of God into everything that we do to see fellowship with God for the glory of God spread to all the peoples of the earth.